Live from ZTN studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. Welcome to The Chase. This broadcast is brought to you by the United Nations Development Programme in partnership with ZTN. I am Owen Kaura. Now, this is the second episode in a series of discussions around promoting low emissions development strategy, LEDS or LEDs, and nationally determined contributions, NDC awareness here in Zimbabwe. Now, let's just start with a bit of a background information to this issue. Now, globally, climate change and its accompanying challenges continue to obstruct human development. The government of Zimbabwe, through the Ministry of Environment, Climate, Tourism and Hospitality Industry, has made significant strides to address climate change in a quest to attain a climate resilient and low carbon economy. Now, also recognizing the threat of climate change, Zimbabwe is party to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is also known as UNFCCC, and it's a Paris Agreement. Under the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, countries communicate their intentions are to reduce emissions in the post-2020 period through what are called nationally determined contributions, like I said before, NDCs. Now, Zimbabwe communicated the first NDCs in 2015, committing to reduce emissions in the energy sector by 33% per capita by the year 2030. And in line with the Paris Agreement provision to review the NDCs every 5 years, Zimbabwe embarked on a process to enhance the NDCs by increasing ambition and expanding sectoral scope. And in our last TV episode, we discussed the NDC's revision process and country ownership issues. We also looked at the contents of the revised NDCs and its sectoral coverage. And now in today's episode, we discussed the envisaged implementation and impact of the implementation of the NDC commitments on Zimbabwe's development. These TV programs are organized by the Ministry of Environment, Climate, Tourism and Hospitality Industry here in Zimbabwe in partnership with the UNDP Climate Promise, with the aim to raise awareness on NDCs here in Zimbabwe. And I am joined virtually by 4 panelists who are going to help us analyze and understand these issues better. And I will start with the Director for the Climate Change Management Department in the Ministry of Environment, Climate, Tourism and Hospitality Industry, and that is Washington Jakata. Good evening, Washington, and welcome to the program. If you may kindly unmute your microphone, Washington, so that we can hear you loud and clear.
Good evening.
There we go. And we also have the Principal Director for Parliamentary Programs and Resource Mobilization at the Parliament of Zimbabwe. Now, I know technology will be our friend this evening, and I'll just want to welcome Nesbet to the program. Welcome, Nesbet.
Yeah, thank you very much, Owen, and, thank you very much, viewers.
Loud and clear. Thanks very much, Nesbet. And we also have a representative from the United Nations Development Programme of Zimbabwe, and that's Tafadzwa Dlakama. Tafadzwa, welcome.
Welcome, Owen, and good evening, viewers. Thank you.
Thanks. And the only lady on the panel, and she's a representative from the British Embassy, and that's Francesca Stidston. Welcome, Francesca.
Good evening, welcome, and thank you.
Now, it looks like technology is being our friend, everyone, nice, loud and clear. And I'll start from a very, very simple place, and I'll start with you, Washington. How does the revised NDCs relate to other long-term climate change strategies on mitigation and adaptation? Washington, if you may kindly unmute your mic. There we go.
Revised nationally determined contributions envisage mitigating in the long term up to 2050. So if it is in the renewable energy area, we shall do it stepwise. From now up to 2030, then probably from 2030 to 2040, 2040 to 2050. As we move on towards contributing towards the global goal of a carbon neutral world by 2050. So all the mitigation actions that we put in our nationally determined contributions really emanate from the strategies, the plans, policies that we already have in place and which really are supported.
Well, it looks like we're having a bad connection there, Washington, but we'll definitely come back to you as well. So maybe we can just quickly move on to Nesbitt. You are from the Parliament of Zimbabwe. Maybe you can start from a very simple place again, from the Parliament of Zimbabwe's perspective. What is your view of Zimbabwe's revised NDCs?
Thank you very much, Owen, and from where we sit, as Parliament, I think the good thing is that the nationally determined contributions are essentially, homegrown. They are not a prescription that is coming from the UNFCCC, neither are they a prescription that is, being, brought down to us, by, the Paris, agreement. Save the fact that, it just, provide, guidance. And the NDCs that we have now, that have just been launched, are essentially a culmination of a very broad, consultative, process. And I'm very happy to say that, this process, had Parliament, also in the center of it. And specifically, the Committee on Environment, Climate, and Tourism Development, as well as the Portfolio Committee on Energy, and also the expanded Committee on Sustainable Development Goals, which I think is very, very, very critical. And what is also important is that the NDCs are very, very clear in that, for their full realization, this can only happen if there is affordable international support, whether it is through, direct grants, whether it's through, investments, whether it's through the transfer of technology, and also the capacity building, of those who essentially be, in the forefront of this implementation. And Parliament is a representative, of the people, definitely, welcomes, such, an NDC, which essentially is born out of a broad consultative process, and also which is conditional to the availability of resources. Back to you, Owen.
Well, thank you very much, Nesbitt. From what you've said there, it ties in with what I'm going to ask Tafadzwa just now. You said there's need for international support, and that brings you in, Tafadzwa, from the United Nations Development Program. Then what has been the role of development partners in facilitation of the NDC revision process here in Zimbabwe?
Thanks so much, Owen, for that question. So the NDC revision process in Zimbabwe was assisted under the banner of the Climate Action Enhancement Program, which was assisted by a number of partners, namely COMESA, FAO, ICLE Africa, ILO, IRENA, Stockholm Environmental Institute, UNDP, and UNEP and World Bank. So the development partners had two main key objectives that they were assisting the government of Zimbabwe, namely Objective 1, to enhance NDCs, including raising its ambition as part of its Paris Agreement NDC update process, and then Objective 2, to fast-track implementation of the NDCs, including providing in-country technical expertise and capacity building, which Mr. Samuel has just alluded to. So the assistance of development partners in the NDC revision process in Zimbabwe has happened under 5 key service lines, which is service line 1 on building political will of government and will of societal ownership, and service line 2, review, align and update existing targets, policies and measures. And then the third action was to incorporate new sectors and greenhouse gases, and then obviously the revision of the updating of the current NDCs, and then assessing the cost and investment opportunities of those NDCs once are there, and then monitoring the progress and strengthening transparency. So these are some of the work streams that are developed doing in Zimbabwe to deliver on its pledge to assist Zimbabwe in the NDC revision process. So obviously there are other actions that have happened, and all these were sufficiently met, and now the real task goes towards implementation. So I think I would then just leave room for others to also just respond before we move on to the other areas. Back to you, Owen.
Thanks very much, Tafazo. We'll definitely talk more about the implementation as the program goes on. But let me just come to you, Francesca, as well. Parties to the Paris Agreement are in the process of preparing and finalizing the NDC to be submitted to the UNFCCC Secretariat ahead of the 26th Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, otherwise, or rather popularly known as COP26, which you're going to be hosting, well, your country is going to be hosting in partnership with Italy in November this year. So again, from a very simple place, why is it important for the UK to support Zimbabwe's revised and ambitious NDC program?
Thank you. So the UK is really pleased to have contributed towards Zimbabwe's enhanced NDC. COP26 for us as well, for many, is widely viewed as the last chance for countries to genuinely demonstrate their commitment about acting on climate change. And as the COP26 host, the UK is really committed to delivering a successful summit. And for us, that success will be measured by our international partners such as Zimbabwe stepping up and showing their ambitious and credible nationally determined contributions. And this is all to keep global temperature increases below 1.5 degrees. And we think this really is the last chance for countries to come together and really show their commitment. So the NDCs will determine the future global action on addressing climate change, and the Zimbabwe's revised NDCs will set Zimbabwe's priorities on climate change, which will help us to identify areas of support and collaboration. Thank you.
Well, thanks to you, Francesca. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned that this might be the last chance that we have, especially around global warming, reducing it to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, we'll talk about that as we go on as well. But I just want to come to you, Washington, and I hope your connection is now better. Because in the last, when you started in the last round, you were not able to really, not able to hear you, what you were saying. So maybe, Washington, let's just start from how does the revised NDCs relate to other long-term climate change strategies on mitigation and adaptation from your office?
Yes,
Well, Washington, it looks like your connection is still bad. We'll try and get you on the line as well. So just hang on. Our producers will be calling you shortly because unfortunately we can't hear you properly. So maybe we'll just come back to you from... Washington, my producers are telling me that you might need to switch off your video and then we can just hear the audio because it's pretty bad. All right. Whilst Washington is sorting out his connection there, let's just quickly come back to you, Nesbet. How do you foresee the impact of the revised NDC on Zimbabwe's socio-economic development in view of Vision 2030? Nesbet, you might need to... Yes. Great.
To issues of climate change, as well as, pursuing a development agenda. So it is important that, all this is clearly articulated, in this economic, blueprint. I think what is also, important is that, it's the NDC one, carries with it, all the partners who will make possible, the responses to climate change effects, as well as championing, the development agenda. So there is space for the executive, there is space for the legislature, there is space for civil society organization, there is space for development partners, and there is space, for the, communities, for the electorate, which Parliament, ably, represents, in Parliament. And the Parliament of Zimbabwe is also very clear, in its support, both to, sustainable development, and also both to mitigation and adaptation of, climate change, effects. And this is, ably, demonstrated, through what is currently happening, or which will be happening as from the 10th, of October, which is the budget consultation process, where you are seeing, I think for the second time running now, a joint committee of budget, finance, and economic development, together with an expanded, SDG, committee, going out there to get views, from the people on exactly how they would want, to shape, the 2022, budget. And it is common cause, in my own opinion, that, we will find more, representation, in terms of responses to climate change effects, coming into the budget, now. So essentially, this is, my take on, the impact of the, revised NDC, that it will get a lot of support coming from the electorate, filtering through, Parliament, and supported by budget. Back to you, Owen.
Well, thanks very much, Nesbet. We'll definitely talk about how the citizens are receiving this later on as well. But I just want to come back to you, Washington, and I hope your connection is now sorted. Washington, is it sorted now?
Yes, I think it should be sorted out. I've switched to the mobile phone now.
All right, that's fine. So maybe Washington, just go back to the very first question. How does the revised NDCs relate to other long-term climate change strategies on mitigation and adaptation, Washington?
The revised nationally determined contribution really is the expansion stratification potential from the initial energy sector to cover the rest of the sectors that are pronounced in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, I would say, documentation that are inclusive of the waste sector, industry, the AFOLU, which is agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, to add to the energy sector emission reduction targets that we had initially in the 2015 intended nationally determined contribution. So all the strategies, policies, actions that we envisage carrying out in the revised nationally determined contributions are emanating from having place and lined up, especially in the national development strategy one, including large-scale projects like the Batoka, the Devil's Gorge project, solar projects, among other projects, including also exploitation of geothermal potential in Zimbabwe, which emits less than the current fossil fuels that we are using for electricity generation. So the long-term strategy really is stepwise. From 2020 up to 2030, 2030 to 2050, up to 2040, up to 2050. So the issues which are enunciated in this nationally determined contribution in broader perspective, articulated in the long-term low emission development strategy. But the difference actually is hence the long-term we envisage carrying out.
All right, thank you very much, Washington. I think that's been very clear now. But maybe let me just stay with you there now, because we're looking at implementation, and each and every one of our panelists will give us their thoughts around implementation. So I'll start with you, Washington, since you're already there. How do you ensure that, the timely implementation, monitoring and reporting of the NDC actions?
First and foremost, we have to sit down and come up with an implementation framework for the nationally determined contributions, as well as the long-term economy-wide emission development strategy for the mid-century emission targets. What we envisage carrying out is an analysis of stakeholders mapping now, to see which stakeholders are key in terms of emissions themselves. And we are envisaging carrying out some audits, energy efficiency, water use efficiency. And we are to come up with a climate change bill, an act that will enable the government really to implement the emission reductions or assist and guide implementation of the emission reductions with respect to data collection, data analysis, and also guiding the various companies and sectors to come up with these strategies, and also some, I would say, apportionment of the emission reduction targets within sectors, depending on perhaps the magnitude and the size of the companies, the entities, the institutions, and so that we see everyone getting into the fold, including the tourism sector, where we look forward to see a clear pathway towards greening the tourism sector itself, especially to do with refrigeration and air conditioning, which is emitting gases which are already condemned as having high global warming potential, and to transform to the more.
Well, it looks like you're breaking up again, Washington. But it's very clear from what you've been saying that we need an all-stakeholder approach. And just now you're mentioning the issue of refrigeration and air conditioning. So we'll come back to you later on, Washington, as well. But at least we got to hear the bulk of what you wanted to say in terms of implementation. Now, that naturally brings you, Tafadzwa Dlakama, in. From a development partner perspective, what would be the role, well, your role in implementation of the revised NDCs?
Thanks so much, Owen. So in terms of implementation of the NDCs, I think this is one and part of the facets of developing countries.
Sorry, just hang on, Tafadzwa, just hang on.
To move forward.
Tafadzwa, just hang on. Washington, if you may kindly mute your mic, please. Thank you. Carry on, Tafadzwa.
So I think if you see in terms of the revised NDCs, I think across the globe, and especially in developing countries, they specify the need of having means of implementation in their NDCs, and much of these NDCs are conditional. Just as you can see also for Zimbabwe, the revised NDCs that were launched yesterday by the Honorable Minister are conditional upon international support. So if we're looking at the means of implementation, we have to ensure that we actually support the various countries in the issues to do with climate finance, with technology transfer and capacity building, which has to be included in the information of the implementing entities and the timeframes that have been identified identified. If you look at Zimbabwe's revised NDCs, it identifies the number of key institutions that are integral to Zimbabwe meeting its revised NDC commitments of 40% per capita by 2030 across all sectors. So one of the key things that you can see in the revised NDCs is that they identified 17 key areas for mitigation that need to be addressed and 4 key areas on adaptation, which various development partners we're operating and working in Zimbabwe can collaborate towards its full implementation. Already as UNDP, we're working with various areas of this. As you may know, our current strategic plan has come to an end, but recently has been approved by the board. And one of the key 3 areas where UNDP is going to be working in the next strategic years from 2022 to 2026 on key pillars, which include people-centered, equitable human development and well-being, which addresses the issue of adaptation, which we also want to look at. But broadly, we also have another key pillar of environmental protection, climate resilience, and natural resources management, which also touches on some of the key sectors in the revised NDC. Maybe if we look at mitigation, if you look at the affordable sector, those are some of the things. But beyond that, we don't want to only look at climate action as an issue of addressing mitigation and adaptation, but we also want to ensure that we enhance and embrace all these 2 key pillars in advancing economic transformation that results in equitable and inclusive growth. So those are some of the key pillars that as UNDP, we're going to be assisting the government of Zimbabwe in the means of implementation that they've identified in their conditional NDC target that they've submitted and launched, when we soon to see will be broadcasted to the international community once uploaded on the UNFCCC Secretariat. So that is our commitment and the role of UNDP as development partners in the means of in the implementation of the revised NDCs. Thank you. Back to you all.
No, let me just stay with you, Tafazo. In terms of implementation, from your work that you've been doing so far, do you think citizens understand issues around climate change?
Thanks so much, Owen, for that interesting question. You know, in the beginning of the NDC revision process, I think there was a knowledge, attitude, and perception study that was done across all the various provinces, and we wanted to understand if people know about climate change and what is their source of information around climate change. And we saw that a lot of people have been utilizing the various media spaces that are out there, radio, TV, internet, to get information. And to be honest around it is that most of the people that responded to some of these questions, even the Mission 1.5 game that has been distributed amongst the youth, is that these are people who have at a higher level of education. And I think it's now important for us to also go to the ground rules and people who may not have access to some of these medias of communication. And if you look also, yes, people also know today the minister was officially there was an official handover of the youth policy brief on climate change, where they also did their own consultations in their constituencies to actually find out if people of the youth know about climate change in the various sectors which are already covered in the revised NDC. So there's still a lot of information symmetry that is there, but we need to break that silos. Thank you all.
Great. Thanks very much, Tafazo. And I'll come to you, Francesca. Now, what is the UK doing to help fight climate change and promote green recovery? Of course, you're now living in the COVID-19 era. So what are you doing to promote recovery, or green recovery, post-COVID-19 here in Zimbabwe as the British Embassy?
Thanks, Aaron. So the UK is working with partners to increase resilience to shocks in Zimbabwe, reducing the impacts on the most vulnerable and accelerating the transition to more climate resilient, low carbon and environmentally sustainable economies. So I'm particularly working in 3 areas. The first is working with civil society, especially the youth, to amplify their calls for change, accountability, and that's all linked in with the NDC. Second, we're working in collaboration with other donors and with the government, so on implementation of the NDC, following up on the commitments. We're also working on the development of the inclusive and pro-poor National Climate Adaptation Plan. And then thirdly, improving economic conditions requires to increase private sector investment for renewable energy. Now, the other thing we're doing also is working through delivering programs that build evidence of proof of concept on adaptation and mitigation in climate change. So the UK funds a program called the Zimbabwe Livelihoods and Food Security Program. That's along with the EU, Sweden, and Denmark. And we also fund the Zimbabwe Resilience Building Fund. And over the last 75 years, I think the UK has spent about $140 million on those programs. And together they have supported close to 2.4 million vulnerable Zimbabweans to cope with the climate change and the effects of climate change and improve their food security and resilience. So through these programs, the UK supported farmers to grow more nutritious and climate-resilient crops, develop community-level climate adaptation plans, and introduce biofortified crops, such as Pumvudza, if I pronounce it correctly. Apologies if not. And then we have a new program which is called the Climate Adaptation Water and Energy Program. And this will improve community adaptation around water, building climate-resilient water and renewable water energy infrastructure. So this includes the installation of solar-powered water systems and rooftop solar systems in vulnerable schools and health centres. Furthermore, we also strengthen early warning systems so that it helps communities to prepare better and respond to climate and weather-related shocks. And then through the UK Support to Africa Climate Energy Programme, we've helped to catalyse a market-based approach for private sector delivery of renewable energy, electrification technologies, with a specific focus on high-quality standalone solar systems. Back to you, Owen.
Well, thanks very much, Francesca. But just before I let you go, as we get into the next round of questions, just a quick one. Yesterday, we saw your Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, lauding praise on the United States. Well, the United States has doubled the amount of money towards fighting climate change to developing countries. Your take on that?
So my take is that everyone has to contribute towards addressing and tackling climate change, but particularly we're looking to work with those countries who are the highest emitters, America being one of those. And I think if we're going to really keep global temperature rises below 1.5 degrees, we need commitments from the likes of the US and from China who contribute very substantially to the effects of climate change. We need them to make commitments in order to meet that target.
All right, so thanks very much. And if you're just joining us, welcome to The Chase. This broadcast is brought to you by the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, in partnership with ZTN. This is the second episode in a series of discussions around promoting low emissions development strategy, LEDs, and nationally determined contributions, NDC awareness here in Zimbabwe. Now, we also have Washington Jakata, who is from the Ministry, the Department of Climate Change Management Department in the Ministry of Environment. And I hope your connection is now much better. Washington, can you now hear me? Washington? All right, that leaves me. Well, I'll have to go to you and come to you, Nesbitt. In terms of, you didn't say anything in terms of implementation.
Yes, I've been hearing you throughout.
All right.
Very well. Yes.
It looks like, sorry, Nesbitt, it's fine. It looks like Washington is now back and we can hear him loud and clear. So, Washington, in terms of funding, what is your ministry doing towards NDCs? What's the plan of action?
Thank you very much. I think before I get to funding, there was a question which was asked Tafadzwa on awareness. When it comes to awareness levels, we look at 3 layers. One, the individual, the institutional, as well as the systemic, which is the band of policymakers and decision makers. So if you get to a point where you have decision makers and policymakers
Well, unfortunately, Washington's connection is pretty bad. It's very poor, but he was... And our engineers should be working on that as we speak. So unfortunately, Washington, you might have to mute again, and then we'll come back to you as you articulate your point there.
This has been demonstrated by, as well as the NDCs. Normally, the individual gets to understand.
All right, as our engineers work towards that, I'll come to you, Nesbitt, in terms of implementation. If you may kindly, yes.
Thank you, again. Essentially looking at the role of Parliament, in supporting the implementation of the Zimbabwe's revised nationally determined contribution. I basically would want to draw our viewers and listeners to the fact that Section 119 of the Constitution of Zimbabwe confers, Parliament with the power to protect the Constitution and promote democratic governance, in this country. And in this regard, Parliament then is the supreme, oversight, legislative and representative body, in Zimbabwe. And that Parliament also has the power of the purse. That is, it basically passes, the budget. So you can already see, the kind of, power in Parliament can actually have, as we implement, the NDCs. So in executing, its oversight, function, Parliament, now has got the role to ensure that the revised NDC, is being, implemented by the different ministries, departments, agencies, and also it has the role from its representative function, to get the knowledge on the NDCs, to the constituencies. So essentially, it has got, that role, of representation, as well. And the fact that, Parliament also, oversees the work of the executive, it will also, by default, be seeing and providing oversight on the implementation of the NDC. It is also important to note that Parliament actually defines the importance of both mitigation and adaptation. Essentially, the Parliament represents the people. And if it elevates mitigation, if it elevates adaptation, it is also by inference elevating the implementation of the NDC. And the fact that just recently the Ministry of Finance put out a circular which actually mainstreams climate change. So every ministry, department, and agency is expected to mainstream in its budget for 2022 issues of climate change. And obviously, Parliament is an oversight body. Will ensure that climate change is mainstream. And if climate change is mainstreamed, then again it will also ensure that what has just been launched, the NDC that has just been launched, also gets priority, in terms of budgeting. Also, Parliament, if you probably know, also shapes, policy and its implementation. And it is the forum in which most issues, are discussed. Again, it is important that, I think motions will be raised, to discuss the implementation, of NDCs so that they can get, momentum. I think the issue of are people aware of climate change issues? Are people aware of NDCs? Again, I think if this is popularized through Parliament, then I think we'll get, a lot of traction. Thank you very much, once again, Owen.
Thanks very much, Nes. But it's interesting that you mentioned that climate change is now being mainstreamed across the government. But you also raised another important issue, the issue that I raised with Tafazo and which Washington was trying to also address. You as a parliament, you represent the people, and you touched on that a bit. that we need to to conscientize people in terms of climate change, issues around climate change, because it affects everyone at the end of the day. So what programs have you put in place to make sure that people do understand, the people you represent do understand?
Yep, thank you very much. I think the starting point really for us, and which I think the climate change management department has done very, very well, is to build the capacity of the members themselves. Because normally the assumption is that, members, come in and they've got knowledge, around issues of climate change. So the process has been, the capacitation, of members, in accordance with their different, committees, the Committee on Finance, the Committee on Mines, the Committee on Energy, the Committee on Environment, Climate, and Tourism Department, just to mention, some of them. So this has been the starting process. And essentially then what this means is that, or the expectation is that our members of parliament also now go out to their constituencies and also, build the capacity and also build awareness, amongst, their constituents. And they have got, the freedom and latitude, to call upon the Climate Change Department, to call upon other civil society organizations to assist them again in ensuring that the knowledge basically transcends, from the center actually to the periphery.
Well, thanks very much, Nesbeth, for articulating that point. And I hear Washington Jakarta is now back online. Washington, just to confirm, you are online. Washington? Oh, sorry, unfortunately, Washington is still not online. So once we get Washington, he will then articulate some of the points that we want articulated in terms of the Ministry of Environment, Climate, Tourism and Hospitality Industry. But the good thing is we have experts around, and I'll just come to you, Tafadzwa, now. In terms of the linkage between the revised NDC and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, your view around that?
Thanks so much. I think also up to say the linkages between the revised NDCs, the 2030 agenda, and the National Development Strategy 1, which dovetails with our Vision 2030. So if you look at SDGs, they are integrated and they're an integrated and indivisible aspect that has to balance economic, social, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development. If we look at whilst the Paris Agreement aligns with the 2030 agenda and demands climate action, it also shows that similar sentiment is also anchored in the NDS1, which is a particular thematic area on environment, natural resources, and climate action. So as we move forward towards implementation of these key documents, the revised NDC, Paris Agreement, the revised NDC, the Agenda 2030, and the NDS1, we have to ensure that we transform them into intangible results. So alignment of these agendas is imperative to reducing the duplication and increasing efficiency whilst maximizing resources, the technical capacity, the information asymmetry, and expertise that may be shared across the various sectors. So many of the actions that have been highlighted in the revised NDCs have the potential to generate mutual benefits across the 17 SDGs. Similarly, actions defined to meet SDG targets have the potential to contribute towards NDC commitment. These are not mutually exclusive, but actually come together and ensure that we address this. I'll give an example of SDG 3, which most people think is in the health sector, which looks at preventing of diseases and deaths and boosting health and well-being. But if you see that if we healthy lifestyle, ensure healthy living, in a safe environment, we're actually ensuring that all this, the SDG 3 is actually achieved. So if you see, because climate change is done towards this revised NDC, it shows that it can lead to increased spread of tropical diseases, malaria, at the same time directly affects the health of all through a deterioration of air quality, soil quality. That's why the revised NDC includes short-lived climate pollutants and also includes various other gases in the NDC. So because the climate-related extreme events will not only directly cause deaths and injuries that can harm the well-being and the healthcare services and the vital infrastructure. You see more people now wanting medical attention, and you see the medical bills now soaring. So whilst many of these activities, I'll give you another example of the decent work and economic growth, which is SGA. Many people may look at it from a reduction of a mitigation point of view, but it can also result in ambitious and increased climate resilience, which is a concept aligned with climate adaptation, as well as SDGs like SDG 2, which is focused on ending hunger. So empirical evidence was gathered as part of this revision process through the Green Jobs Assessment tool that was done by UNDP in conjunction with ILO, which showed that in Zimbabwe, if we're going to be advancing some of the key SDGs, the greatest benefit may actually be attained by advancing the agriculture, forest, and others, because there are more jobs that will be created. At the same time, these also have more adaptive capacities, which is one of the key areas African nations are focusing on, and that is, so I'm saying that SDGs in the country's NDS Agenda 20 cannot be taken and cannot be implemented in isolation, but we need a holistic and all societal ownership of this document so that we can advance the climate action, improve the people's life.
Well, thanks very much, Tafaza. Like you rightfully said, the SDGs don't work well. They're not standalone SDGs. One SDG affects the other. I also hear that Washington is back, so we'll just try again. Now, Washington, before you left the platform, we're talking about funding, and you're also talking about implementation of the NDCs. So please go ahead, Washington.
Yes, with respect to implementation of the NDCs, what is critical and foremost is the development of an implementation framework that guides implementation of the NDCs in the country. This implementation framework has to be supported by a climate change bill or a climate change act that is on the rules, roles, and responsibilities of
lost Washington again. Well, he confirmed that we've lost to Washington. But let me just come to you, Francesca. In terms of you, your country being the COP26 host and incoming co-president, would you please tell our viewers and other stakeholders on whether the conference in Glasgow will be virtual or in person? And then what measures have you put in place to reduce the risk of COVID-19 transmission?
Thank you. So the UK is working tirelessly to deliver a safe and successful COP26 in Glasgow this November. So working with experts and our COP26 partners, putting in place all the necessary mitigation measures to prevent COVID-19 transmission. So this will include strict COVID testing protocols throughout the conference itself. And we're also encouraging vaccination of all COP26 delegates. And there'll be quarantine requirements in place as well, particularly those arriving from red list countries, and hardly that includes Zimbabwe. But also in person, the meetings, again, to kind of mitigate the possibilities of transmission of COVID-19, will be encouraging social distancing, and we'll also be asking delegates to wear face masks when moving around the conference centre. But yeah, we're doing as much as we can to keep it as safe as possible, but we're very keen to have an in-person meeting. Thanks.
All right, thanks very much, Francesca. Now, just as we round off the program, I'll start with you, Nesbet. In terms of your views around issues of climate change, I'll give you your 3 minutes to round off.
Thank you very much. I just want to speak a little bit about the transition from a brown, economy to a green, low carbon economy. We have got a very ambitious, NDC, a 40%, reduction, per capita. But I think, as we implement and as we also take cognizance of the conditional, implementation that I've mentioned, I think that Tafaza has mentioned, I think it is also critical that we also, look at just transition. As we transition to, green energy, a green economy, we also need to be mindful of the plight, of those who were employed, for example, in the mines. What is it that we know we are going to do? Are we going to create green jobs? I think is very fundamental. If there is going to be any form of compensation in the event that there is abrupt closure of Wange coal mine or whatever it is. So I think the in the matrix, the issue of a just transition, I think, is very, very, very critical. We need to continuously, think about it, so that we are transitioning, we are mindful that we are not stranding any assets, and neither are we stranding any communities. Back to you, Owen.
Thanks very much, Dennis, but you bring in very important and critical issues, especially in terms of just transitions. Will we still have jobs left after all this is done? But I hear now that Washington Jakata is back. Washington is the Director for Climate Change Management in the Department of, Department in the Ministry of Climate, Tourism and Hospitality Industry. So Washington, technology was not being your friend today, but still we got a few points from you there. But now, just before you got cut off there, you were talking about funding and implementation. How do you envisage funding of the NDC implementation, and what strategy is in place from your ministry?
Yes, in first and foremost, we should remember that the revised nationally determined contributions are conditional upon provision of funding from various international multilateral funding mechanisms, as well as ourselves, of course, mobilizing our own resources and also sensitizing the private sector on the issues of climate change, their roles, responsibilities, some of which will be mandatory, which require funding both domestic and in some cases international. But with the incorporation of and mainstreaming of climate change in budgeting right now, it gives already the government the leeway to already demonstrate the feasibility of mobilizing domestic financing to jumpstart the process of climate change mitigation as well as adaptation. And we envisage carrying out some audits with respect to water use, energy efficiency in the private sector, in the public sector, and everywhere, and to apportion emission reduction targets which should be guided by an implementation framework for the NDC supported by the Climate Change Act. So the financing itself, there is the Green Climate Fund, which was created by the Cancun Agreement to really be resourced by developed countries to the tune of 100 billion annually, which will be accessible by developing countries for various programs, projects, the development of policies that will create also an enabling environment for the nations to really go green. So the World Bank is also unveiled or in the process of unveiling a $200 billion facility up to 2025 for access by developing countries who really have got concrete plans, concrete actions, concrete projects and programs that they wish to carry out in the coming years to access funding. But these funds are not for anything to do with fossil fuel development. These are funds mainly skewed towards development of renewable forms of energy that contribute towards the emission reductions, of course, towards a neutral globe by 2050. Thank you.
Well said there, Washington. Now we could really hear you and well articulated. Thank you very much there, Washington. And we're just rounding off of the program, and I'll come to you, Tafadzwa. Your closing remarks.
Thanks so much for that question. I think my closing remarks is that I think the recent sixth assessment report of the United Nations IPCC report shows that we need to take urgent actions if we're going to reduce the catastrophic nature of climate change in the next decade. Is one of the youth members that I heard today saying that the future generation will judge us harshly by the actions that we make today, especially COP26, and that's why Zimbabwe has already done a fair and a fair contribution in light of its current circumstances, showcase to even developed countries the increased commitments that they've done by increasing their commitment by 7% in the revised NDCs. Thank you.
Well, thanks to you very much, Tafadz Gwatlakamad. Like you rightfully said, the earth does not belong to us, it belongs to the future generations. And Francesca, coming to you, your parting shot. Francesca, if you may kindly unmute your mic and give us your closing remarks.
Sorry. Yeah, no, my closing remarks would be just to say, really pleased to work with the government of Zimbabwe to get to where they've got to. A lot of really hard work has gone into preparing the enhanced NDCs. I will look forward to receiving the delegation in London. I hope there's a successful conference. We've worked very hard with both Zimbabwe, but all the countries that are parties in the UNFCCC to ensure that it's successful. Successful determined by whether we're able to reach commitments that allow us to keep temperatures below 1.5 degree increases. And then I think after COP, it'll be about implementing and following them through, making sure that people live up to what they've committed to. Thank you.
Well, there we go. Thanks very much. And that's it on this edition of The Chase. This broadcast was brought to you by the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, in Zimbabwe, in partnership with the ZTN. This was the second episode in a series of discussions around promoting low emissions development strategy, otherwise known as LEDs or LEDs, and nationally determined contributions, NDC awareness here in Zimbabwe. And as you know, climate change issues are very topical these days, and they do affect you and I. So we need to really know what is really taking place. Many thanks to my guests. And of course, you for watching. Stay connected with us on our social media platforms, on Twitter at ZTN News, Instagram at ZTN, and of course, our website is ztn.co.zw.